Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well Through Crisis VIP webinar series. Really appreciate that you took the time in mid-January to join us, and this is the first webinar for 2021, so thrilled that you're here. I couldn't think of a better guest expert to have to join me this afternoon, and the response to this session has been extraordinary, so really happy to be speaking with Sally shortly. For those of you who have come back, welcome. This was the Do Good to Lead Well webinar series was launched really early on as a way to mark the launch of my first book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership, which was published through Forbes and Forbes Books, and really wanted to, for me, I had the great fortune and privilege to speak with best-selling authors, TED speakers, global experts on leadership like Sally. And so what I wanted to do was find a way to be able to share this extraordinary opportunity with other people and create a community of conversation. And then with COVID-19 last year, really wanted to zero in on Do Good to Lead Well Through Crisis. And so over the last 9-10 months, have done over 60 of these and have welcomed wonderful guests to the program. And as I mentioned, I couldn't think of a better person to launch the series for this year. Sally is truly extraordinary. She's a best-selling author, a speaker. She's a leadership coach. She was cited by Forbes as the world's premier expert in women's leadership. So this is a wonderful opportunity to ask your questions. Sally has kindly agreed to take questions from the audience here this afternoon. She's, for over 30 years, she's been engaged in wonderful leadership and powerful thought leadership around women in leadership, around inclusion. She's written multiple books. Her latest, How Women Rise, which was co-authored with Marshall Goldsmith, who many of you know, became an immediate bestseller, top in its category about a week after it was published. So many accolades for this book. She also wrote the Female Advantage, as well as the Web of Inclusion. The Female Advantage, although it was published in 1990, has been considered a classic in its space and is continued to be published. So, which, I mean, as you know, in this current environment, it's tough to have a book in publication for a couple of years. To know that this has been on the shelves and available for over 30 years in print is just remarkable. She's done so much work around the world and globally. And so without further ado, and I've left out so much in her bio, I want to welcome Sally to the program this afternoon.
Hello, Craig. Welcome. It's good to be with you and your participants.
Well, and as I mentioned, please take advantage of this opportunity, Sally. Within the chat box, you can ask me ask Sally as many questions as you'd like over the next hour. So I'd love to. I mean, you've had such an extraordinary career. You've been at the forefront of leadership and women's leadership. What got you into this space? And how have you seen it evolve over time?
Well, I'll answer that first question first, how I got in. It was really not anything that I particularly intended. I had been through the 1980s. I was in corporate communications, primarily a speechwriter. And what I noticed is that the organizations that I worked with, which were excellent, were very poor at understanding what women could potentially contribute at a strategic level or as leaders. And I felt often that I heard some of the best observations in the women's lounge about what would be helpful for the organization. So I decided to try to investigate and learn from how some of the best women leaders did things in hopes that organizations would, in my mind, get a clue. And that was the research that became the Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership. And I think because it was really the first book that looked at what women had to contribute, as opposed to just how women needed to change and adapt. Because of that, it really got picked up on. There was a lot of interest, a lot of articles about it, and companies started calling me in to work with their women, to speak to their women, and things just snowballed from there. And I've written 6 more books in the field of women's leadership or inclusive leadership, and just kept up that practice, and it's been very rewarding.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, your book, The Web of Inclusion, you were really one of the first, if not the first person to infuse that word inclusion into the business narrative. Is that correct on my part?
Yes, that actually was the first instance of the language of inclusion being used in a business context. So that too, and this was way back before inclusion and diversity were paired. So
Right.
it was really intended as looking at what inclusive practices were and how companies could benefit from those.
Well, and again, this is an extraordinary read. I recommend it to every single person on this webinar. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I have so much highlighted. It may not show up in the lighting, but there are so many fantastic lessons that I think are within it. So, and I love the story around how this came about. And I think it's such a powerful one. So can you talk a little bit about the genesis behind this book?
Certainly. The How Women Rise, it really focuses on the habits and behaviors that are most likely to get in the way of successful women as they seek to move higher in their career. And the way it came about was I was very influenced and just loved the book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, by my longtime colleague and friend, Marshall Goldsmith. But increasingly, that book was published in 2010, and increasingly, especially in all the women's leadership workshops that I was doing throughout the 2000s, it was clear to me that although Marshall had had a fundamental brilliant insight in that book, which is that the same habits and behaviors that can serve us well early in our career can become stumbling blocks as we seek to rise, and yet we remain loyal to them because we know they've gotten us where we are. So I thought that was brilliant. But I also noticed that many of the behaviors and habits that Marshall focused on in that book, while some were gender neutral, others did not resonate at all in terms of what I saw working with women. For example, he started off with learn to apologize, which was pretty hilarious, given that I work every day with women who can't open a door without saying I'm sorry, or who may begin their contributions with those words. Other things like that, don't always talk about how great you are. That was not a problem. The women had a tough time speaking about their achievements. So I suggested to Marshall that, and we'd had a colleague suggested earlier, but I suggested to Marshall, let's collaborate on a book that takes this model but looks at women, drawing on our, at that time, combined about 70 years experience coaching and working with women. And so How Women Rise is the result. And it's proven very resonant around the world. Just last week, I went to the mailbox and found my Korean and Hebrew copies of the book. So it's been widely translated, and it's been the big surprise for me is how resonant it is in different cultures.
That's so wonderful, and for me, everybody that every coaching client that I have, and everybody in my network that I say, hey, you have to check. Everybody has said, what a fantastic read, and the concepts, the ideas are so timely and powerful, and they generalize, and I'm not surprised in terms of that global response, because you can just see within it. And questions. I mean, this is why I was so looking forward to this. So have a couple of questions queued up already. So Tara was wondering, so love the habits that you talk about through, in your experience, which one is maybe if it's fair to ask, which one is the most prevalent habit that derails women, and what can organizations do to really support women in leadership?
Okay, two different questions. Let me take the first. What I find, it's often generationally or level determined. What I find in general are the habits that are most resonant are the perfection trap, perfectionism among women, which interestingly is encouraged in organizations to a certain degree, because one of the things that Marshall and I learned in researching the book is that women are often rewarded and promoted based upon their being precise and correct
Mhm.
in all they do. So that, in a way, encourages and sends the message that what is rewarded is a kind of perfectionism. So perfectionism, and then the other one that's very resonant is expecting others to spontaneously notice and value your contributions rather than coming up with a plan to do that yourself. Now, there are a number of communication habits.
Excellent.
I'm finding ruminating very popular in the COVID era. And then with younger women, I'm seeing the communication habits, especially too much and minimizing, as problematic.
Mm. Well, and this is great answers. And again, already more questions coming through. So Jessica asks, how can we continue to support women's growth in the workplace during a time when women are having to take on even more of the at-home responsibilities during COVID?
Yes, and that's a very, very challenging situation. I think it's helpful to separate. We're moving to a more virtual workplace. That's not always going to be true, certainly. People will show up in offices again often, most often probably, but much more virtual work. And there are challenges for women there, though there also plenty of advantages. I've worked with companies that have had a hard time attracting women because they have no offer, no ability to be able to work from home, even on snow days when their kids are home, etc. Something you probably have heard about in Canada as well. But so I think that there's some advantages there, but many more, also many distractions that have to be managed so you can show up professionally without too much going on in the background. I do think it's a good time to practice not being a perfectionist, because there's a lot we can't control when we're home. So letting down some of that fierceness over protecting a professional identity. But also, once COVID has to some degree passed, once we have sufficient numbers of people vaccinated, it's going to be less challenging because of schools being open, because of people being able to, caregivers being able to come into people's houses. So I think that will change things. But there is absolutely no denying that there's some challenges for women. And there are also some challenges in terms of some of the things I talked about. The visibility issues are tougher when we're doing it virtually, and I think require a pretty intentional approach that may not have necessarily been required when we could run into people and let them know what we were thinking when we were in the coffee break room.
Well, awesome. And have another question here from Tracy. So as I said, fast and furious. So I love that people are taking advantage of this opportunity. So she was wondering, to what extent, we'd love to get your thoughts in terms of, to what extent do you feel that the lessons being taught in How Women Rise apply to women of color?
Well, because I hear from so many women of color, I hear that they apply profoundly, though often in slightly different ways. Certainly, one of the habits I have in there is overvaluing expertise. Women are used to having their expertise questioned. They've had that experience. And so they tend to often overinvest in expertise, forgetting that the three legs of a successful career are visibility, connections and expertise. So they underinvest in the first two. Now, what I find is that especially women of color are even more accustomed to having their expertise questioned. So they can fall even more into that trap of trying to constantly prove their expertise, which then will undermine you. Another thing is a number of these habits are related to managing perceptions. And this is something I think I've only really become aware of working with a book, doing many dozens, probably really hundreds of workshops all around the world, from Kuala Lumpur to Lagos to, you name it, Sao Paulo, etc., as well, of course, all over the United States and Canada. And one of the things I've learned there is that women invest a lot of energy in trying to, because I hear, I don't want people to think I'm too ambitious. I don't want people to think I'm too aggressive, etc. And that can be a trap, managing those perceptions. And that, again, operates at a kind of double speed for many women of color, because they're concerned about perceptions. I worked with a woman fairly recently in UK who she was of Jamaican descent, and she said that she constantly feared being identified as an angry Black woman. And so that perception, that fear, that belief that she had to manage everybody's perceptions and make sure no one ever thought that, hobbled her in terms of being able to claim her achievements, feel that she was a full contributor, and really showing up in a leadership way. So I think in those ways, there's potentially an extra layer that makes it even more important to recognize and address what these habits are.
And I love it. Great answer. And have another question from David, who is wondering what organizations have you seen doing this really well, or can you share some of the initiatives across your career that you've seen where organizations have done this right?
Yes, certainly that's true. And I'm not going to name them in this forum, but I have worked with organizations that in the course of a journey have really learned to address some of these issues. And what I see is, first of all, men have to have an awareness of some of these factors. What Marshall and I talk about in this book are internal barriers that hold women back. And an awareness of what those internal barriers are can be extremely helpful to men. So that's number one. Secondly, what I find, and I've done a lot of work because of the web of inclusion, I've done a ton of work in diversity and inclusion ever since the name evolved in the workplace, ever since we started hearing it in the very late 90s. And what I've found is the most successful approaches, and the ones I try to use in my own work with men and women, have to do with creating a culture in which inclusive behaviors are recognized. Excuse me a second. Recognized, encouraged, and people are held to account for practicing inclusive behaviors. They have to be modeled at the top, but those at the top also have to hold those at more supervisory levels to account for behaving inclusively and for really being explicit about what constitutes inclusive behaviors. I find that a more successful approach than the unconscious bias orientation, which is popular in a lot of organizations. And it's not because we don't all have unconscious biases, because every single one of us does, but because I think that you're more likely to change your mind, that is your biases, as a result of practicing new behaviors that create different experiences than changing your mind because you learn in a class that you have biases. So that's what that's the approach that I advocate. It's the approach that I teach, and it's the approach I consider myself a real evangelist for.
That's fantastic. Well, and another question from Tim, who's wondering, can you share a little bit more about love to focus on behaviors? Can you share a little bit more about what are some core examples of inclusive behaviors that leaders can demonstrate to create a more inclusive environment?
Oh, certainly. Very active listening. Not interrupting people prematurely when you're listening, waiting, having that response. Some people are, the minute they get cut off, they'll clam up, especially when there's a power differential. Making sure that in meetings, people are not stringently arranged according to their levels. I was working with an insurance, a big regional insurance, just before COVID, where you could show up at their offices, and wonderful people really trying to make progress on this, on these inclusive behavior issues. And I went to a meeting, and all the very senior leadership team was seated right around the table, and then people were in ranks depending on their level behind them. So it reinforced this idea of there is a hierarchy, and there are therefore levels that matter. So just in terms of that arrangement. Another is when you speak. It's very interesting. Of course, leaders have long discovered that if they speak too early, it influences the entire tenor of the conversation because everybody's going to agree with them. But it's more than just that. When a leader speaks up early, they tend to shut down people's participation. And I was always struck by, I was very fortunate, along with Marshall, to have had direct exposure to Peter Drucker back when he was alive. And I was always struck that Peter had a ironclad rule. In every meeting, he was the last to speak. Now, this always had the impact of giving him a feeling of a lot of authority. But it also was, I thought, a real great demonstration of inclusive behavior. And then finally, another one that I've seen practiced at its most superb by Alan Mulally, who was formerly the CEO of Ford, is being very free to admit when you don't know something if you're in a leadership position. And really, Alan was amazing in that he was once very early, I think in the second week of his tenure at Ford. He had always been at Boeing, always been in the aircraft industry. And he was asked a question, and he said, I have no idea. This is my second week in a car company, but I know someone here will know. And after that, it changed the behavior among the leadership team, because people saw that they didn't have to use every opportunity to show that they were the expert.
Well, and I love that both of those stories and the power of saying I don't know. I think that's just exceptional. And I love I have an ironclad rule that I'm going to speak last. I'd be curious. There's a New Year's challenge for everybody watching. Is the next group meeting you're in, put that in front of you to say, okay, I'm going to speak. I think that is and as you say, it shuts down, it closes the engagement of other people. I think that's a wonderful way and ironclad. So I think that's fabulous.
Craig, I have a little trick for that because I tend to love to jump in. In what got you here won't get you there. I identify with the habit of adding too much value. Marshall teases me about that quite a bit. So what I've developed the habit of doing is when I have a conference call or anything like that, I write on a piece of paper and set it up so I can see it that says wait. What that stands for is, why am I talking? Is there a reason that I am talking? It's a useful trick for doing what Peter did.
Absolutely love it. Yeah, and I loved an acronym. Really, really powerful. I have, again, questions keep just chiming. People are thoroughly enjoying this, so thanks again. Not surprised. I have a comment from Jane, and she really, your conversation or your observations about unconscious bias really connected with her, and she's had some struggles and had similar thoughts around. Is there anything else more you'd like to add? Because that's such a hot topic, and yet there's, had some questions, and so was really appreciative of you separating the two. So can you talk a little bit more? Is there anything you can add? Because she's very interested.
Certainly. One thing I can add is that I do believe that the hunt for unconscious bias, first of all, doing it skillfully is really tough. And it often stirs backlash. And one thing I've tracked is the number of times we've had very high visibility backlash incidents, like that man who worked at Google who began, posting about, his neck, how women were overvalued at Google and they got all the breaks and all that kind of stuff. So, and that traced back to some degree to him being part of an unconscious bias program and coming to feel very, very resentful on it. And I think we have to be careful about policing what people think, as opposed to trying to set policies around what they do, that can very easily be interpreted as invasive. And the other thing I think, and this may be a little controversial, but companies at a certain point, and it's been, really within the last, say 5, maybe 10 years, depending on the company, decided they needed to do something about equity and justice and, getting better at taking advantage of the diverse workforce which exists. And there wasn't much out there. There are women's leadership programs, but there wasn't, then people would say, well, why is it all women? Why is that the only issue here? So certain companies began supplying unconscious bias, and it was kind of the only thing in the marketplace. So organizations, I think, really jumped on board without necessarily thinking it all through. Now, I am not an expert on what all the different companies are doing, and I'm sure that there are some of these initiatives that have been very successful, but I do hear from clients about quite a few that don't really move the needle and that can stir backlash. So that's where my thinking comes through. So I think it's a good time to rethink this, and I want my contribution in this field to be really spurring people to look at inclusive behaviors, defining what those are, seeing how they resonate, and trying that out.
And I love that. And Jane said thank you. That was fantastic for the add-on, and I definitely very much resonate with the focus on the defining of what is inclusive, because I think we can throw that word around and everyone can, you can ask people, are you inclusive? I would imagine everyone on this webinar this afternoon is like, absolutely. And because we're having very different definitions of that. And then so the behaviors, and I love that point, Sally, which is, well, now we can assess how well we are being inclusive, as opposed to, are we thinking we're inclusive? Now you have a scorecard, and now we know, am I speaking like all those kinds of things. Now you have a much better understanding about what it means and if we're accomplishing it. So I love that train of thought on that topic.
It makes it more concrete. It makes it concrete, whereas a word like inclusion can feel very, very fuzzy. And one of the early ways it began to manifest was just organizations throwing something about inclusion into their value statement. We value blah, blah, blah. And it, as a former speechwriter who wrote a lot of values and mission statements that had nothing to do with the company, I'm always a little skeptical of those. But if they're not defined, they really mean very little. So I like the idea of being more specific.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, more questions coming in. This is fantastic. Question from Michelle. Do you have any advice for women on asking for feedback or advice without coming across as insecure or too direct or aggressive?
Well, first of all, maybe let go a little of the managing perceptions and just focus on what it is you really want to know, as opposed to what somebody might think of you. But I think another thing is approaching it, two things that spring to mind. Marshall has this wonderful concept of feed forward. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very helpful concept. So rather than coming out of a meeting and saying to someone, how do you think I did? Saying to somebody, oh, I'm glad you were there. I'd love your thoughts on how I might be a little more effective in the next meeting, because I'm trying to benchmark myself on this specific behavior, which I think may be undermining me a little bit. Say something that's very tangible. In the book, the too much, too many words, too much background, too much disclosure. You can even say, I've had a little feedback that sometimes I'm not concise enough. I'm really working on it. And if you see any opportunities going forward for me to think about how I might present in a way that's more concise than what you just saw, I'd love to hear that. So that kind of informal enlistment can be effective. Another kind of informal enlistment that's very effective is in not even specifically to a situation, but more like say, let's take concise again as an example, because it's so concrete. Go up to somebody who you've just watched a meeting was very concise and say, I really noticed how concise you are in your presentations, and I admire that. It's very effective. I'm working to become more concise myself, and I'm wondering if you have any tips for me. Is there anything you do, for example, in preparation? Because in my experience, people who are concise are prepared. That's just me as an aside. If you have any tips for me that could be helpful. So even if the person doesn't come up with any at that time, they may in the future. They also will notice, hey, she's really getting more concise just because you brought their attention to it. And I think the most important thing is when you ask for, whether it's feed forward, whether it's that kind of informal enlistment that I often work with clients, the important thing is don't ever push back. Your job is not to say, well, that's it, thanks, but that wouldn't work for me because, or, well, that's not quite right for the session, etc. The word but or however or should not appear in your answer. It should just be, thank you for your help. And then you have the right to think about it. Maybe it's not appropriate for you. Maybe it is, but you don't really need to share that with them. So I think that's the most effective way of getting the support you need in these kinds of situations.
Well, I love those examples, and building on what we were talking about before, Sally, about that specificity at the beginning where you're like, hey, I'm wondering about my performance here. So rather than, well, what do you think? People are like, I don't know. I think 101 things, what's going to be helpful? And so when you really zero it in, then they can give you much more actionable, valuable feedback. And so I love that. It's just such powerful tips that all of us today can go and use that, because one of the things that we need in order to be at our best is feedback. And you've just given such incredible tools to be able to go out and be much more effective in that way. Because in conversations I have with people, one of the things, I wish I could get better quality feedback. And then, so how can you do the work to get that? So I absolutely love it. Another comment / question from Tina, who says, I love this discussion, going to get the book. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I'm finding it really challenging to navigate COVID with everything. Is there any advice, suggestions for perfectionists and how to help us?
Perfectionism is one of the toughest things to get rid of. It really, really is. And it's not, just informal enlistment or saying to somebody, hey, I'm trying to be less perfectionistic. Do you have any advice? Is often, very, very challenging. It helps to know the costs and to be really clear about the costs. If you are perfectionistic, you have trouble delegating because people may not do the job as perfectly as you demand. You cause stress. You cause stress for yourself and you cause stress for other people, which is why it's such a toxic behavior at a senior level, because you create a wider ripples of stress. So there are many, many problems with it. I did say at the beginning, I do think COVID makes it so difficult for us to be perfect, because we're dealing with so much, that this is a good opportunity to share your vulnerability when it's appropriate, to push back, to say, you know, under ordinary circumstances, I would love to get this report to you by tomorrow afternoon. I'm dealing with a number of things because of the pandemic. So what I'd like to ask you is, how important is it that this be a finished product, that this be done to 100%? Is 80 okay? Is a day late going to be $1 short? You know, so that you look at it almost not exactly so much as a negotiation, but that you put out there what the reality is, and then you get a sense of it. You know, in some cases, they're going to say, you know what, this has to be done exactly right for X, Y, and Z reason. Often they're a perfectionist, and that's why they're saying it. But it does help to use that little heuristic of 80, 90, 100, and recognize that most things don't need to be done to 100%. You know, I often share this story, but I was in London just about a month before lockdown, speaking to a large group. And I made the point, you know, about most things don't need to be done to 100%. And I kind of tossed off a comment, you know, maybe that's different if you're a surgeon. And people kind of laughed. And afterwards, this woman came up to me and she said, I want to challenge you on that. She said, I am the head of surgery at the Royal Ophthalmological Institute down the road. She said, and I'm here to tell you that our perfectionistic surgeons get the worst results in every case, because they're inflexible and because their teams are afraid to tell them what's going on. So I figure if it's a problem for surgeons, but I think that heuristic is very helpful to perfectionists. And I think that practicing a little bit of vulnerability when you think it's appropriate is also helpful. You know, one more thing, I worked with a big defense contractor in Hartford, Connecticut, over the way here. And the woman who was the head of HR there, was very experienced, very savvy, said, you know, we have so much problem with perfectionistic female engineers that we have started putting them in jobs they can't possibly really do well, just so they get comfortable being uncomfortable. So that made me think that another thing you can do if you're a perfectionist is sign up for something that you know, something that you don't really have the skills for, and kind of learn how to be comfortable out.
Well, and I think that's such a powerful observation in this climate, in terms of just being comfortable with not being expert in any in a particular area, and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that's such a good, and using this moment as an opportunity to, hey, why not? As there's no guidebook to reflect on in this space. More questions coming in, so this is great. Have another one who asked, what should senior executive women not do if they want to be supportive of other up-and-coming women in their organizations?
What should they not do? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I've never had that.
Or maybe what should they do as well? So,
well, I think that one of the things, you know, it's interesting. People often ask me, what are the three, you know, what things have changed that you've witnessed most in the last 30 years that you've been in women's leadership? And they are definitely, women are more confident. There's a greater sense of solidarity. And there is a much more openness from men to be allies for women. So those are the three things I see. But the solidarity question is really important. And I think that what senior women can think about is, how do we start fostering a sense of solidarity among the women in our unit, because women, and the research demonstrates this over and over, women need to feel a sense of connection, and solidarity, need to know they're valued in order to thrive. They really have that need. And so you want to look at, what can I do in my unit to create better relationships among the women who are here, to minimize that kind of competition that can come when there's a feeling of scarcity, and an awareness of that. I think that's a very important thing to do. The other thing is to not expect perfectionism, because organizations really help foster perfectionism in women. So you always want to be asking yourself, am I doing anything to foster perfectionism among the women? Because that's not going to do them any favors, and it's going to create, quite a bit of stress in our unit, division, or in the organization as a whole. And, I was making this point at a program I was doing recently, virtually, and a woman contacted me through LinkedIn a few days later, and she said, I really took that to heart. She said, and I've decided I am never again going to, when my 8-year-old daughter does something well, say, perfect. She said, I'm encouraging her to be perfectionistic. So that's really helpful, not rewarding perfectionism, being on the lookout from it, and demonstrating some degree of humanness yourself, without over disclosure or, self-mockery. That's not going to help you as a leader.
Excellent. No, I love that. So good. And love, again, that very tangible take, small things that we can do even innocently enough around perfect, and not be aware of, what are the deeper implications of this? And so it's a wonderful way to do a bit of an audit, or raise our awareness maybe of how we speak, how we describe things, how we reinforce behavior in others, and what messages we're sending.
Yeah, exactly. And, perfectionism often causes rumination. And I'd like to take this opportunity to tell another story about perfectionism and rumination, which has to do with me. Now, Marshall, if anybody knows him or has sat in, Marshall is so far from a perfectionist, and he is certainly not someone who ruminates. He does not give himself a hard time, no matter what it is. So he and I, when we were working on the book, I was down at his apartment in New York City. I live about 100 miles north. And we were in the middle of working. We did not take phone calls, but he got a special signal from his assistant. I heard him, yeah, okay. Yeah, Dr. Kim, I was supposed to call him at 2:00. Yeah, I forgot. Okay, I'll call him back. He hung up the phone, he looked at me and he went, oh, well. Okay, now I knew who Dr. Kim was. He was the CEO of the World Bank at that time. So as I'm coming back on the train, I'm thinking, all right, if I missed a call with the CEO of the World Bank, would I go, oh, well?
Right.
Not a chance. I would be beating myself up for a week. And so the next morning I had something happen that I messed up. It was not earth shaking, but it was painful. And so I decided to print out a big poster and put it on my office wall that says, oh, well, so I could remember, oh, well, oh, well means I'm human. Oh, well means I forgot. Oh, well means there's probably a chance to repair this damage. And if there isn't, I will survive. And I did a program at Google, and this young woman came up to me and she said, your oh, well is my absolute favorite thing in the book. She said, and I put stickies up all over my house that say, oh, well, because I need to remind myself. And she said, the other day, my 3-year-old daughter came into the kitchen carrying a big bowl of yogurt, and she tripped and it went all over. And she just looked up at me and she said, oh, well, because she'd heard me say it so many times. So she said, well, okay, I'm raising the next generation of a confident, non-perfectionistic woman.
Absolutely. And I love that. I think it's so, again, for so many of us, these, and I love the behavioral based, right? Like it's that assertion, it's making that a mantra around, oh well, like it's not that you actively seek out to do these things, yet we're human, as you say, we're all going to make mistakes, and we're going to make some, you know, really big mistakes. That's also a part of being human. And so that at what cost? And I love how you talked about it, Sally, in terms of I'm going to survive and I can repair that relationship and I can own up and all kinds of other and learn from it. So, you know, that doesn't happen the next, what can I put in place? Or if it does, like, so I love that. And I think, and thank you for that personal story around, you know, what kind of reminders can we put up? I
Yeah.
love the WAIT acronym, as you said, when you're on a webinar, you're on a call, you've got it there, or any of us in a meeting, when we return back, you know, having that available or having little cues. I mean, I think these are just magical things, and really is why, again, I will say, please everyone go get this. It's such an impactful read. I have another question. I really appreciate this. So diversity brings a wealth of different perspectives and really valuable insights to the table, yet organizations can really be obsessed with alignment. So how do you reconcile those potentially competing forces?
That's a very interesting dichotomy to raise in those specific terms. And yes, there is a wealth of research that demonstrates that especially diverse teams and units are more creative, more imaginative, come up with more solutions, come up with better solutions, are more harmonious, are more engaged, all the things that organizations say that they are seeking. And yet it often is difficult for organizations to put that diversity in a team in place, especially if they feel that there's a lot at stake. And that's often because of just what the questioner cites here, this sort of misunderstanding of what alignment is. Alignment really is a similarity in what you perceive of as the larger purpose here.
Okay.
Today's environment, the nature, let's think about what's the difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is a description of the nature of today's global talent base. That's what it is. Inclusion are the habits and behaviors by which a diverse workforce is most effectively managed. So
Right.
where does alignment come in terms of that? Alignment comes in with the leadership's responsibility to identify, what are we really trying to achieve here? Are we trying to innovate a new product or a new service? Are we trying to make an incremental improvement on it? Are we trying to address a persistent customer or client satisfaction issue? Are we trying to figure out how we're going to upgrade our skills given some technological changes? So the leadership's responsibility is really articulating what the challenge is and then identifying the sort of mission in terms of meeting that challenge without micromanaging how people get there. And that's where the problem comes in, is in the interpretation of alignment as something of micromanaging, and everybody's hearts and minds have to be on the exact same page, and everybody has to have similar values. One of the consequences and fruits of diversity is that people have very different values. They have different values on any team and in any workplace today, in terms of everything from what kind of humor is acceptable to obviously political things, but also just work ethic in terms of how you demonstrate your work ethic. So there's a lot of diversity there. So you don't want to try to be mandating values. You want to try to be identifying and constantly calibrating a mission that is going to engage people's spirits while addressing the fundamental challenge, which you really need to be clear about.
Okay, that's really powerful. And have another, these are thought-provoking questions. Here's another one, a longer. I'm very curious about your take on this. So how much of the habits that you introduced in your book hold women back because they limit growth into leadership roles? And how much do you believe it's because the workplace is still so deferential to the male perspective? And there's a follow-up. So how much time should we invest in growing ourselves versus shifting the workplace perspective? It's both. The question
It's
is,
both. Yeah.
acknowledges both. Which is going to be the shortest, have the longest impact? So
First of all, I think that certainly there are habits and behaviors that hold women back, internal barriers, but there are also external barriers that are cultural and structural barriers in organizations that play out differently in different workplaces and also in different teams and units depending on what who the leadership is. So those external barriers absolutely exist, and we're not pretending that internal barriers are the chief cause, and once women address that, everything's going to be beautiful in organizations. But we do recognize that unless you are at an extremely high position in an organization, you're probably not going to have a huge impact upon larger cultural and structural barriers. But the one thing we can all have some measure of impact on is looking at our own habits and behaviors and what might be getting in our way. And from my experience over the 30 years, what I have seen is that women have because women have a bigger impact as they rise, that finding what may be getting in your way, maybe getting in the way of your rising to a higher position, and addressing that effectively is going to increase the likelihood of your achieving a position of influence where you can begin to have an impact on the cultural and structural barriers. So start with where you can have an impact. One of the most helpful things I ever read in my life was a kind of a very powerful, very successful self-help book published many years ago, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And in that book, the author, Stephen Covey, has this little graphic where he talks about your circle of concern and your circle of control, what you can control and what you're concerned about. And he says that the most effective individuals are those where there's the clearest alignment between, or the clearest overlap between their circle of concern and their circle of control. So if you're in your 5th or even 8th or 10th year in an organization and you're somewhere in the middle, whatever, or in middle upper management, your circle of concern, if your circle of concern is changing the whole organization, that may be a recipe for frustration because that's not matching your circle of control.
That's fantastic. Well, we've got a little over 5 minutes left. The time has just flown by. And here's another question. So coming in, this is fabulous from Carol. Do you have recommendations to women in an assistant support role, or how to get out of that support, out of that support box and be viewed as a contributing member of the team and not just a support person?
Definitely. First of all, you want to be very clear about what your achievements are, what you have achieved in that role. Number one, you might want to keep a running record because we often forget, oh yeah, that was very successful. I did a good job at that. A couple months later, we've forgotten, especially in this era when we're, it's kind of chaotic and so much is coming at us. So keep that list for yourself. And then find a plan for making people aware not just of what you have achieved, but of what you've learned and of what your ability to contribute really is. So, that second behavior in the book that I mentioned before, expecting others to spontaneously notice and value your contributions. Don't expect that. Find a way to represent that, to get known for that, and then be clear about what you're aiming for. Women often hold back in this way, often hold back. They don't want their boss to think, that you're trying to, move on and move away from, what he or she has, and that you're ungrateful for what he or she has done for you, or that you don't like them, or whatever it is. Be clear about what it is that you want to do. And in some specific terms, it may not turn out exactly that way, but not just, I want to move on out of a support role, but I've really learned a lot in this role, for example, X, Y, and Z. I've developed some connections in this way, and here's where I think I might be able to make a bigger contribution in the organization. And then instead of, what do you think? But, and any advice, any thoughts you can have, any help you can give, that would be greatly appreciated. Women are often reluctant to do this. They don't want to appear disloyal. They're afraid someone somewhere might think they're ambitious, God forbid. They don't want to, I don't know, they're just reluctant to do this. I mean, I went through all this myself. This isn't a mystery to me. So you want to be a little bit explicit and explore where you think you could make a larger contribution. And I think the language of contribution, as opposed to achievement, is really valuable here, because again, women often have internal feelings like, I don't want to look like I'm in this all just for myself. And by using the language, I think there's a bigger contribution I could make. Then that can help you get comfortable with it. So I think this question that I've just gotten is really, really important. You want to think also in terms of skills and in terms of connections. What's needed to get there, and how do you begin to build that, and then begin to build your ability to be recognized for it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. And this has just been an extraordinary, got so many positive comments. The one last question, if you don't mind answering, I'm curious, what are you most proud of in terms of, now that How Women Rise has come out, what's something that you're is a large source of pride for you?
I think the pride that I have in this is really what you've been mentioning. I've seen the power of a book and also of programs, because I do a ton of, keynotes, but also especially virtual workshops now and master classes, to see the power of real tactical advice and solutions, rather than exhortations or grand themes or descriptions of how things should be or could be better. I think that the reason we've had so much resonance with this is because of the tactical nature of the insights, the advice, the practices, and that has continued to grow as I have had the opportunity to interact with so many women and men on this all over the world.
Well, thank you and congratulations, and I couldn't agree more. It's the comment, and I continue to get awesome session from comments from people, and the point that I want to emphasize, and it's the feedback I receive as well with my executive clients, is that tangible, practical things that I can put into practice. So rather than like sometimes concepts, ideas can be exciting, and what do I do? So I would highly recommend pick up a copy of the book, go to the website, check out all of the fantastic work that Sally has been doing, all of her books. And Sally, I just want to say thank you so much. I know you have so many demands on your time, and the fact that you spoke with a Canadian, Canadian audience today, and I know some come from around the world too, but mostly Canadian. Really appreciate it, and wish you and yours all the best in 2021. Couldn't have picked a better way to start the webinar series for this year.
Thank you, Craig. I really enjoyed it. These were great questions. It's good to connect. I've been doing a lot more work in Canada since we've been doing it virtually. Find it extremely satisfying. So, and just a shout out, glad to connect with people on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Yeah. So please follow up, connect, and yeah, take those steps. So until the next webinar is going to be Thursday morning at 11 a.m. I'm welcoming UC Basada, the CEO of Home Trust Group Inc. So please join us for a fabulous conversation from one of Canada's top CEOs. Until then, take care, everyone. Thanks again, Sally. This has been awesome. All the best. See you all soon. Bye for now.